You're listening to the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. So let's get into it, Mark. As I do with all my guests, I'd like to take them back to when they first got started into cricket. And it's been fascinating listening to people's memories on how they got started into cricket, Mike. So let's go back to the very beginning, growing up. What are your earliest memories of watching, playing, and even going to the cricket? And who were some of your cricketing idols growing up?
Well, it's not difficult, Jack, for that. I grew up in South Australia, in Adelaide, and I had a summer god and a winter god. And my summer god was Les Favell, the great South Australian opening batsman and an Australian batsman for a period of time. Unfortunately, he played Test cricket everywhere except in England, but that's another story. I try not to blame Norm O'Neill for running him out in the Thai Test for 49, which ended sort of disrupted his plans to get to England in 61. But that's another story. So Les was my summer god, and Bill Wedding, the Nord ruckman, was my winter god. And I have a wonderful childhood of growing up and watching Les play, the compulsive hooker and cutter that he was. I think any boy that grew up in that period in the 50s to watch Les in full flight was something very special. And in fact, it was his philosophy, which to a large degree laid the platform for the Chappells. And when you look at the succession of leaders they had after Favell, right up to Hooks and then on to Lehman and one thing or another, you can see the Favell philosophy always prevailed in South Australian cricket. So I think anyone growing up in that period was excited by the way Les played the game. And so, yes, I've got strong memories of leaving school. I was at Pulteney Grammar School doing my senior school for 3 years and then Saltash Business College. Then those urgent runs from Victoria Square down to Adelaide Oval when you knew Favell was still in position at the crease, crossing the Torrens and into the ground. So, good memories of coming in on that southern gate, the old John Creswell stand that it was then, of course. Then was the Bradman stand, and now, of course, the bank stand. That shows how old I am. I can remember the stands before the real bank stand. Good memories of running in and hoping Les Favell's nameplate was still up on the board when I got there.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's what cricket does, doesn't it, Mike? It draws you in when you first make contact with it, doesn't it?
Very much. It's a very seductive sport, particularly the traditional game. I'm not too convinced that the short form is particularly seductive. It's explosive, but I don't think seductive. Excuse me. But yes, that's true. It is because of its history, the richness of its tradition, how much reading you've did, particularly as a boy growing up. That's when it was a lot of kids growing up in sport read books about the game and its history. It doesn't happen so much now because it's a visual world. Hopefully they spend a lot more time watching the history on screen rather than reading about it. But yes, it is a very seductive sport.
Any memories of playing cricket as a kid?
Yes, I was a very modest player. I can assure you of that. I opened the batting and bowled occasionally, but I wicket kept basically. I wicket kept, and I enjoyed that. I had some. I've only got one eye, Jack, so that made it a little bit tricky. Funnily, as a wicketkeeper, it wasn't such an issue, nor as an opening batsman, because if you've got problems with your eyes, the real issue is against the turning ball. If the ball is given plenty of flight, it's then difficult to make the judgment. But against pace, most of those with visually impaired in some way can handle the pace a lot more easily than they can the ball that's thrown above eye level. So I opened the batting, and I was a solid enough opening batsman with an occasional 50 here and there. I think my top score was an 80 against St. Peter's College, and that was even more pleasing, given it was against Saints. As you could imagine, the competitiveness in the school system. But I enjoyed it. Played a lot of social cricket after in the newspaper industry. When I was at the Adelaide News, the defunct Adelaide News, where I began in 1963, each year we would play interstate press games against the Melbourne Herald Sun Combine. So it'd be on the Melbourne Express. As you can imagine, the carry on with that. It was a lot of fun, those interstate press matches. So I played a lot, but once you get into journalism, there is no chance really of playing regularly at weekends, because the demands on you professionally. Particularly if you're covering sport, you've got no opportunities to play. So it was midweek cricket in those days, and you would play the likes of the St John's Ambulance, the Fire Brigade, the police, and other utilities that were able to play midweek rather than at weekends.
Yeah, so that's very good to hear that, Mike, and your early memories of the game. And then you branched into journalism and then becoming an author and a broadcaster. And you've written many articles and books on the game and traveling the world commentating and broadcasting cricket. So why did you choose to go into journalism and then branching into books and broadcasting?
I suppose I was a very modest student, Jack. I'll confess to you, a very modest student. I managed English and history, but not much more. I always loved writing, and perhaps I was always destined to write. I certainly wasn't destined for much else. I think the only other profession I would have enjoyed or would have even contemplated was teaching. I think I would have liked to have taught. And I had an experience many years later at Pulteney when I coached the under-15 football team for 10 years. And I really did enjoy that involvement. And I think I could have managed a teaching career and would have enjoyed a teaching career. But I was drawn to writing. And I had a dear friend, or still have a dear friend, who was at Pulteney with me. And his father was Laurie Jervis, who was a distinguished journalist for the Adelaide News, both in politics and sport. And by spending time in the Jervis family as a kid, I got a feel of what it was like, and hence got the opportunity and joined there in the 19th of December, 1963, which is a very distressing, given that this year ends in 3, Jack, it's a fairly distressing statistic. But I've had a wonderful working life, absolutely no complaints, and a privileged one, really. I mean, I've worked hard, certainly, and have to make up for pretty tardy performance in the school years for all manner of reasons. But once I got the chance, I sort of have made the most of it, and also being in the right place at the right time. Luck's a fortune sometimes. I decided after I started, as I said, in 63. I had a year in Melbourne in the Adelaide News Bureau, as it was then. Then I joined the Melbourne Herald for 2 years before I went overseas. In January 1970, by ship, of course. We couldn't afford the plane in those days. Just by chance, I got an opportunity with Australian Associated Press. And I've long believed that the best training for any journalist is either with an agency or with an afternoon paper. Well, now, of course, afternoon papers are defunct, sadly. There's no such thing. But your viewers and listeners would be astonished to know that when I was working on the Herald in the late 60s, the day they landed on the moon, roughly in 69, the number of papers coming out of 44 Flinders Street, Melbourne, on a daily basis was over 1.2 million papers coming out a day. 625,000 Suns in the morning and over 500,000 broadsheet Heralds in the afternoon. I mean, that is an astonishing. That's when, of course, the kids were selling papers on the street corner both day and night. It was a very, very vibrant industry there in those days. But there would be nowadays, of course, what particularly young people get their news in all sorts of ways, and a newspaper doesn't come into the equation.
Yeah.
So it was a very rich period in the industry, and it was an exciting time to be in the industry. So I was very fortunate to be a part of it.
Absolutely. Any favorite cricket books or books that you've written yourself, favorite cricket tours you've covered, favorite programs you've done, and a favorite player that you've interviewed or watched during your time?
Jack, I've been so lucky. Of the cricket books, there are just so many. We'll confine it to Australian cricket books, I think. And then I would say On Top, Down Under by Ray Robinson is probably the pick of them all. It's a wonderful book. Beautiful, detailed portraits of all of Australia's captains. It's a remarkable book. And I worked with Ray. He's been long gone now, of course, but he was a wonderful man and wrote on extraordinary he was later in life, and with poor eyesight, but his writing was just so tiny on a pad as he observed. It was extraordinary. But that's a wonderful book. Gideon Haig's Summer Game is exceptional, and it's just being republished by 81 All Out, the Indian publishers who recently did my book, Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, which was pleasing that was given another life 32 years after it was originally published. And of course, the Archie Jackson story by David Frith is an absolutely exceptional book. And I would say they are the three of my favourite Australian cricket books. I mean, you can look... one of the things about cricket, Jack, is that, of course, it lends itself to literature, more so than any other sport. Golf does to some degree, baseball to some degree, but the richness of cricket literature is exceptional. And, we could spend hours just looking from, the Wisden Almanacs right through today, an attempt to have the Wisden Australian Almanac. It worked for 7, 8 years. The same with Wisden India, but they were introduced just at the time the whole industry was changing. And of course, you can get so much of Wisden online. It's an entirely different world now. But I was encouraged, particularly with my book, Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, because that was the project that meant most to me, because what prompted me to do that in 1990 was I became very uneasy at the attitude of Australian cricket to cricket on the Indian subcontinent. We began as a country, I believe, to either ape the English attitude, which was either, if it wasn't racist, it was culturally elitist. And it made me very angry and very dismissive of what, if it didn't happen in the traditional first world countries, it didn't exist. And the Thai Test in '86 in Chennai, or there was then Madras, and of course the World Cup triumph in Calcutta, now Kolkata, they just were just treated in a very offhand way, particularly by the Australian media. And so I was very unsettled by that. And that was one of the motivations for writing Cricket Beyond the Bazaar, which thankfully I think has had an impact and has helped to educate a lot of consumers about the richness of cricket on the Indian subcontinent and Australia's great involvement. And that led me 2 years ago to write the Frank Tarrant story. Frank Tarrant is one of the most remarkable figures in the history of the game, but is not known. But he fundamentally was responsible because he brokered cricket between India and Australia in 1935, 1936. He simultaneously worked for the Cricket Australia Authority. What was it then? I think it was the Australian Board of Cricket for Control, whatever, one of its titles in 35-6. And he worked for the Maharaja of Patiala, who was the head honcho of Indian cricket. So I've been pushing hard for the Cricket Australia to recognise Tarrant by striking the Tarrant Medal. I believe it should be given to the best Indian player and the best Australian player in a Border-Gavaskar series, as a symbol of Tarrant's influence in brokering what has become now the most powerful cricket contest in the world. I mean, in many ways, perhaps it'll never overtake the Ashes, although there was a time that it was very, very close to overtaking the Ashes. Take us back to 2005 and that dramatic moment when Kasperwitz apparently got a touch on something down the leg side. If England hadn't triumphed then, the Ashes were in desperate trouble. But the Border-Gavaskar series has produced some magnificent cricket over the last 20, 25 years. And so I'm hoping, I'm pushing relentlessly, and we might start on the Indian board next. But sadly, historically, the Indians, as powerful as they are, don't have a great interest in the history of the game.
Yeah, very good to hear that, Mike. And hopefully both cricket boards will listen to your pleas and hopefully do that, because Frank Tarrant was quite an interesting character. I did some research myself and I heard you mention his name. I didn't know much about him myself personally. So he did have an impact on Australia playing India and in that connection there. But I guess that question I asked before, Mike, I guess it's hard to choose a favourite book or a favourite interview you've done, because you've interviewed some of the game's great players. You even interviewed Dennis Lillee was sitting on the edge of his bath, Viv Richards in his bed in his hotel room, and you interviewed the great Sir Donald Bradman in his lounge room. So many great moments that you've had. So it's very hard to choose. It's like choosing your favourite child. You can't.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
But what was it like interviewing those names I just mentioned before?
Well, they're all. I think one of the key reasons with Sir Donald was that, and I had quite a good rapport with Sir Donald. He wasn't an easy man. He was a pedant in so many ways. I can remember him pulling me up at one stage in a piece I wrote. That I had the only interview with him for the 50 years of Bodyline for The Age in 1983, and I made reference to a bar that he'd been given as a trophy, and he pointed out very, very, very quickly it wasn't a bar, it was a drinks cabinet. And that was very Bradman. He was pedantic in the extreme, but he was remarkable. He didn't have a great affection for the press. He felt that he'd paid his dues to the public, and in many ways he had. I mean, he was incredibly generous in the way he would respond to all correspondence and one thing or another. He was a prolific letter writer. The one thing they all have is a charisma. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Viv Richards' charisma was there for all to see. And in the way, the strut, the famous Richards strut, I mean, the arrogance. He wasn't an arrogant man, but he was arrogant in the way he approached the game. He was a supremely confident man, but very accessible. I mean, I interviewed him at home in Antigua with his young family then, and he just delightful company. And I've interviewed him for television for the Bradman Museum at Bowral and other places. But you go from that and the respect they have for each other. I think we saw it more recently, where the relationship between Shane Warne, Brian Lara, and Tendulkar. Now, they are all of such exceptional cricketers. But whatever they had together, I think it was a respect for the genius that they had. They shared a genius in a way. And while they're very disparate personalities, they all loved being together and talking about each other. There's something there that they had that set them apart from everyone else. We could see that as cricketers, that they were apart from anyone else, but they sensed that as well. And I think that I think that applies to the greats, and and there's no greater than those three, and none greater than Bradman, of course, as a batsman. I mean, Sobers arguably was the greater cricketer because of his sheer versatility. And I had the good fortune to interview him on a number of occasions as well. So, I've been very fortunate from that point of view. There's probably not one thing other than the fact that it depends how you approach them too, to a large degree. I'm sure that with Bradman, I respected him, but never kowtowed to him. And I think he respected that. I think he respected someone who treated him in a normal fashion, in a respectful, normal fashion. I mean, he was of an era that placed such store in etiquette and social behaviour, of course. So, woe betide you if you said Mrs. Bradman instead of Lady Bradman or something like that. You'd be in more trouble than the early settlers. He really did adhere to the conventions of his time. And you have to remember, that he was born in 1908. So I mean, what he saw in his lifetime. I think that was the key and I'm sure that's why we had a reasonable rapport, is because I was never in awe of him, but I did respect him.
Absolutely. And that was good to hear your stories about that, Mike. We have mentors and role models in our life that we look up to, Mike. Who were your mentors and role models during your career in broadcasting?
Well, I sort of just evolved in broadcasting. It's interesting. I think that it all really started when I was in Adelaide, when I came back from England in 1973 to the Advertiser. Merv Agars, who was a wonderful man and a wonderful editor, sports editor. He played for West Adelaide in football and for South Australia. He's a very fine footballer. And he lured me back. I had 3 years working for Australian Associated Press in London, where I talk about, luck or fortune with the timing when I got the job at AAP. My first gig, it was the first time, anyway, I'd been overseas. First assignment, Johnny Famechon fought Vincente Salvador, the world featherweight title in Rome. So off I go to Rome to cover that. Then the Eisenhower Cup, which was the World Amateur Golf Championship in Madrid. So toddle off to Madrid to cover that. And then there was the French Tennis Championship, where Yvonne Goolagong and Karen Kransky and so many of the great names of Australian tennis at the time, then to Wimbledon, and then to cover the golf, the British Open golf at St Andrews. So, I mean, in the agency job, I had this incredible opportunity in 3 years to cover some of the great events of sport, the Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, then the Olympic Games in Munich in 1972, the tragedy of the Olympics in 72. So that meant when I returned to Australia, I had a lot of experience in a very short period of time, and for which I was incredibly grateful. Looking back on it now, you realize just how fortunate you were to be in the right place at the right time and being able to, I'd never seen a boxing match. And then the first one I see, other than a fight at the Port Adelaide Town Hall, or probably outside the Port Adelaide Town Hall, was a world title fight in Rome. and things like that. I covered the swimming, with Shane Gould at her peak at the Olympics in 72. I'd never covered a swimming event. So working for an agency tested you. I covered lawn bowls, for instance, at the Commonwealth Games in 1970. So you have to adapt. You have to, be quick on your feet and nimble in every way, and mentally nimble to be able to cope with those sorts of challenges, not to be intimidated or to be awed by the situation. And so by the time I got back, Merv Agars, I had Merv Agars as a mentor there at the Advertiser alongside Gordon Schwartz. Now, Gordon, who only died a couple of years ago, and I had the privilege of giving the eulogy at his funeral. What a wonderful man he was. He lived into his 90s, played football for West Torrens and for Nord, was a very accomplished tennis player, represented Australia during the war years. We always hear of cricket during the war years, but the tennis boys did it as well. So they were more recent mentors. When I started off, I mentioned earlier Laurie Jervis, and Laurie really was the first of the mentors who was able to show me the way when I was just a teenager. And he was of the old school. He was tough. He was tough, but he took a personal interest in me, for which I was forever grateful. And you're quite right, Jack. You do need people like that in your life. And I think as I've grown more senior, to use the euphemism of the day, is the need to, and I've tried in every respect to mentor or be a shoulder for the young ones coming through. And I've had a wonderful rapport with those that have followed over the years. And there's been so many very, very fine young journalists who have come through, particularly in cricket. And I hope in some way that they've felt I was sort of secretary of the Australian Cricket Media Association for many years. And that was quite a big job on tour, particularly in the subcontinent, when most of those you were travelling with had no experience of it. And in your first 2 or 3 tours of the subcontinent back in the 80s were pretty challenging, be told. It's a lot different now, but in those days it was. So, yes, you're quite right. You do need your mentors. And if you've been well mentored and it's meant a lot to you, as it has to me, you then want to give back by mentoring the next generation. And I hope I've done that.
Absolutely. It's all about giving back, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
In society, but also in cricket, it's all about giving back to the game and helping the game out, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's good to hear. You've achieved so much in your career, Mike. When you reflect and look back, what are you most proud of? And do you have any regrets from your journey in broadcasting?
No, I've got certainly none of those. No regrets. I've been very fortunate like that, Jack. Pride, I think the establishment of a standard is one thing. The maintenance of it is another. And I think it's not a question I have to think about very often. It's a good question. And I think probably overall is that I've hoped that I've been able to maintain a standard in the writing and in the broadcasting or delivery. I've certainly become involved in a lot of cricket charities as well. And that involvement, I'm foundation director of the LBW Trust, Learning for a Better World Trust. I'm involved with the Lord's Taverners and with the Primary Club, all very significant charities, cricket charities that have served the community well and continue to serve the community well. So I'm glad I've got that involvement, and I, like to, and I will maintain that involvement beyond a working career. In terms of pride, I think the fact that I feel, well, I hope I have raised the awareness of the cricket on the Indian subcontinent. Because that really did distress me when I first wrote Bazaar, this sort of racist, if not racist, culturally elitist attitude It was out of sight, out of mind. It was the developing world. It didn't really matter. But as I keep pushing, Jack, whenever I speak at these functions, I tend to say, don't forget that fundamentally cricket is a sport of the developing world that is played by a handful of first world countries. And that is basically right. And I think now with the amount of money circulating in the game, it distresses me that I don't think the game does enough beyond the boundary. I mean, there are millions and millions and millions of dollars flowing through the game now in the short forms of the game, particularly the IPL. I've just back, as you know, Jack, from a visit to Sri Lanka and India. And I lived south of Madras for a while in the late 80s when I was writing Cricket Beyond the Bazaar. I went back to the ground where the Thai Test was played, Chidambaram Stadium. And it was absolutely, I mean, I know 1986 is a long time ago, and to many of your listeners and viewers, they will think it's ancient history. But for someone, who's lived over the last 70 odd years, 1986 doesn't seem that long ago. And the Chidambaram Stadium in 1986 was one of the most, with the exception of the Madras Cricket Club area, was one of the most fundamental grounds you could imagine. Big, open, ugly cement stands. Well, now, and Australia is playing India there, I think, at the start of the World Cup in October, it is a stunning ground. And it's all IPL money. It's just been pushed into the... and it is staggering. There's 10 separate grandstands, all with the the ones set in England with the tent sort of like tops.
Sort of the sailing on.
Yeah,
canopies.
exactly. Yeah, and they're all there. The 10 stands. I mean, it is for someone coming back into this environment. It just staggered me. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And so I, looking back over that period, and the number of Australian cricketers who have prospered and profited by being involved in India. I mean, they used to loathe going there. So many of the depressing stories handed down from the initial tour of 35-36, the unofficial tour, which, began the whole relationship. And then, the highly controversial tours of Rats and Riots, we called them, in the 1950s. And a lot of those stories, true or apocryphal, got handed down from one generation of players to the others. So often you had players leaving for India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka with very negative view of what lay ahead because of all the stories that have been handed down unthinkingly by previous players. I mean, yes, it was tough. The hotels were modest, etc., etc. But I always remember in 1986, the Thai Test Tour, early in the piece, and Jeff Marsh was vice-captain no, he wasn't vice-captain to Border, was he, at that stage? I think David Boone was. Anyway, Marsh was in the team. And a rat ran across the floor in the bar somewhere in Mumbai or something, and all the players groaned and carried on. And Marsh said, "Oh, that's just like the rats I've got in the silos at home, on the farm." So it was just a matter of state of mind, and the reason that the Australians now prosper in that part of the world was due to that sort of philosophy that Marsh had, but particularly to the leadership of Border, who's probably my favourite man of all time. What he achieved just defies description. Border, Taylor and Steve Waugh all made tremendous contributions to changing the attitude, the mentality of Australian cricket on the Indian subcontinent. And so now it's a place where Australia's elite cricketers, they embrace it rather than reject it. And they're better cricketers because of it, and they're certainly better men because of it. You've got to be open-minded as well as open-hearted. And if you can be both of that, you're a pretty good human being. And that's the sort of attitude you have now. it's to a large degree a response to the leadership of War, Taylor, and Border. And I hope, getting back to your original question, as I've drifted away as I always do, is that I hope that that I've lifted that sense of the importance of cricket on the Indian subcontinent, and that we should respect it and rejoice in it.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And you just gave a little bit of a preview to one of the topics that we're going to discuss a bit later on in this discussion, which is on subcontinent cricket. So all of our listeners will have a bit of a preview of what you're going to talk about in that section.
Give them a taste. Give them a taste.
Give them a taste. A bit of a teaser. Now that's the... Hi, everyone. Hope you enjoyed hearing Mike and I discuss Mike's cricketing journalist, author, and broadcasting journey.